So this is the remains of Hitler's bunker.
12 метров в глубину была металлическая лестница.
This is the last of the German command of the Second World War's actually intact and standing bunkers. I suppose it's appropriate to have at least a couple of tank wrecks sitting here. During the Second World War, Adolf Hitler had intended on building 19 separate headquarters. During the war, 14 of these were finished to a greater or lesser extent. Some of the finished Führerhauptquartiers was never even visited by Hitler himself. As many as 12.9 million man-days of labor were done during the war solely to construct Hitler's Führerhauptquartiers all over Europe. Now, the largest of these headquarters was Wolfschanze in Poland, a place we have visited several times. There is also the huge complex Hegewald in France. Now, one must keep in mind that with a centralized command structure run under one man, such as a Stalin or Hitler, where he goes, everything he needs to govern the country needs to come with him. And naturally, so does all branches of the military. They need to be represented. But also the various branches of government needs to be close. And of course, with this large entourage will also follow a large number of support staff, from adjutants, secretaries, cooks, barbers, mechanics, technicians, and a lot of guard personnel. In fact, here some 3,000 guards in total. Of course, the large complex in Poland, where the assassination attempt of July 20th took place, is the best known for these reasons, especially due to the large remains, and close by the large bunker complex of the army, and Himmler's smaller bunker 30 kilometers from that. Hitler did spend 800 days of the war here, but unlike other heads of state during the Second World War, Hitler would travel close to the front, and generally follow his advancing troops. So after the initially successful battles in Ukraine, a headquarters was constructed for him here. And nearby, of course, Himmler had his constructed, and Göring had a large headquarters as well. All around the Ukrainian town of Vinnytsia. The construction began as soon as the Russian army and NKVD had been vanquished from the area and it was deemed secure. Let's start with Himmler's bunker, as it is intact, and it comes with an interesting suggestion that there is something under it. Feldkommandostelle Hegewald. It's the strangest thing to see. Himmler's bunker is just sitting here, basically in what looked like a backyard. The main officer's house where the SS officers were located were destroyed. But here, near the bunker, in this house is where Himmler stayed while he was here, along with other officers. The bunker was just in case. It is one of the only remaining bunkers from the German command, which has not been blown up, and no one really quite knows why it has survived either. Being guarded by the old officer's house. And of course there's a cute guard dog here to greet me. Unmolested in one piece. With the original doors. They ran electricity in here because it has been used as a shelter since. But it's almost surreal how much destruction that has taken place to the old World War II sites. But Himmler's bunker is intact, alive, and well. And here it is, with the original doors. Has been refitted ever so slightly for the current war, the emergency exit, and here is the hole in the ground leading down. There it is. Questions is, it's been filled up with stuff, and it looks, there was a staircase there once, and it's been filled up over the years. According to the old man who'd been here since the 60s, there is a washable ladder down, a rung ladder down, and to a room underneath it. This is bigger than the small bunker Hitler had in France, but just big enough to survive an air raid. And you see how thick the walls are in this place, which is pretty damn impressive for a small pillbox. This was for Himmler. If he ever did anything here, set foot in here, is questionable. There was never any need for him to do so. So, expecting somebody to show. The current guardian of Himmler's bunker. This is the last of the German command of the Second World War's actually intact and standing bunkers. For the entire complex, there was 410 laborers, and they totaled 27,000 man-days of work here. It was originally named Waldhof, but Himmler changed it upon arrival. And there is more here than just the bunker. Oh, the slide is missing for the people, but everything is authentic. Everything is here. But this is really all there is to Himmler's bunker. Of course, the interesting part, besides the hole in the ground, which certainly is.
12 метров в глубину была металлическая лестница.
Сюда, Сима?
Да.
Да.
Туда. И, как его, забетонировали, чтобы туда никто не лазил. А сейчас идут разработки. Но война идет, пристановились. До войны разработки, да, туда. Еще подвал вот этот.
So the story is that there is a 12-meter deep shaft to a chamber below the bunker. Victor here lived here his entire life, and he claims to see it before it was filled up. Other historians claim there's nothing, but I personally have never seen a drain this big. But if there was a tunnel, why would it be in the center of the floor? I don't have any good explanations for this right now, but I suppose one day we will all just have to dig it out and find out ourselves. But no signs of damage. It was never set on fire. Some of the weatherproofing. It was claimed that here on the square in front of the officer's house was a large swastika embedded on the ground, or so it was claimed. It seems very inviting to any stray Russian planes, but generally security here was quite lax, as the Germans felt quite safe here, and probably for good reason. Before the Germans' arrival here, the Red Army and the NKVD carried out large-scale executions, and in many places, summary executions of prisoners in June 1941 as they retreated ahead of the German advance. The NKVD prisoner massacres in Lviv, Bryansk, and many other western Ukrainian prisons are well documented. Those killings were widely reported and later used by the Germans as evidence of Soviet war crimes. In Venetia, the NKVD had killed over 11,000 people in mass executions in 1938. From 1942, 9,432 bodies were exhumed by mostly Ukrainian physicians and reburied. Most of the victims had been shot in the back of the head with a .22. Most of them had been shot several times. All of them had their hands tied, but some had their skulls caved in as well. Nearly all identified victims were Ukrainian, but there are 28 Poles and 149 were women, all found in 91 mass graves.
Can't believe all this is still here. But then again, people just lived.
And as the Germans were closing in on the cities and towns, the NKVD now had no time to bury people in secrecy, so they simply massacred them where they were held. Here in Zhytomyr, before the Russians fled, and a few kilometers from where Himmler eventually would construct his headquarters. In 1924, the Jesuit order had founded a monastery and a college. They also had a bakery and made candles. But from 1914 and on, the monastery was used as a prison, and after the communists took over, the NKVD ran it. In 1938, 5% of the town was imprisoned, including 186 women. And when the Germans were at the city gates, well, it was a terrible end for all of them here. I will not recite what the Germans found when they entered. But when people today at times complain that many Ukrainians fought with the Germans during the war, maybe they should see it in the light of what the Russians had done to them in the previous decade before, from starving them to death to mass killings. So when the Germans arrived, they were well received as liberators by most of the population.
This was an old monastery from way back in the day that's sitting in the center of the town that had a bit of a bleak history. This was an NKVD prison before the Germans showed up. They used it as a prison themselves, but the NKVD made this a far more sinister place.
This town is far bigger than you would think looking at the maps or times of the war. When Himmler was here, it looked like a little village. There were several 100,000 people living there then, and quite a lot more now.
Now in complete ruin, but you can still see the metal mesh over the windows. Another place we could tell probably quite an awful history, if it could. The NKVD murdered thousands of people in prisons as the Germans were advancing towards them. They found entire basements full of corpses that had been strangled and beheaded. It's like one of the old seats. The NKVD would never keep it a secret. If they killed people, they would just dump the bodies in the parks or bury them there so they could be found and discovered. They wanted to know what kind of terror they were bringing to the party.
So when the Germans showed up, a lot of Ukrainians helped them, which can hardly be a surprise after the Russians having first starved a quarter of the Ukrainian population to death, then subjugated them, taking their farms, and killed them or any kind of resistance willy-nilly. You can't really blame them for looking to the Germans as liberators. And the relations were generally far more cordial and better when the Germans were occupying the area than when the Russians were here or when they came back. And here are the sirens of a different war, the one that's going on today still. Another air raid after a long sleepless night because of air raids. Not sure what you're accomplishing here, but goodwill is certainly not one of them.
lot bigger than you would think, looking at the maps and times of the war, where it's referred to as a little village. It is no longer a little village.
This entire area was, several times over, a vast battlefield, and here were, during the war, a large cemetery, far larger than it is now, but it is worth a visit before pressing on to Hitler's headquarters.
You don't see a lot of these in the territories that was the former Soviet Union, because most of these were destroyed. This was reconstituted in the 90s on behest of the German government, who was paying for it. These are a lot of the German soldiers that were killed here and fighting back and forth. That was buried here, not far from Himmler's headquarters. And it used to be at least 1.5 times larger than this back when it was here during the war. Now it's somewhat confined, but there's lots of graves here. Interestingly enough, there's one grave here that is, well, not here. When this was arranged between the Ukrainian government and the Germans that there should be a cemetery here and that the Germans would pay for it, one name had to be erased, that of Theodor Eicher, who was buried here after a plane accident not far, which is interesting. Of course, he is somewhat of a notorious person in the Third Reich, but he is missing, and so is his body.
Theodor Eicher was a World War I veteran and an early party member. He joined in 1928. He was eventually the second in command at Dachau and was instrumental in designing the concentration camp system, and would eventually get his own SS Guard unit, which would grow into the SS Totenkopfverband. And later, as inspector of concentration camps, he reorganized the camp structure entirely. He was extremely strict, he hated communists, and was exceptionally anti-Semitic. He was killed during the Kharkov offensive as his Feindlich Deutsch was shot down. He was buried there initially, but as the Russians came closer, his body was removed and buried here, on behest of Heinrich Himmler. Here he would stay until 1996, when it was insisted that his body be removed before it became an official cemetery.
Also, Hitler's pilot is buried here. Well, one of them. He was killed in a partisan attack while he was hunting. This was a fairly safe area at the time for German soldiers, although of course those partisans everywhere. 1941 deaths. Maybe they could paint the cross a little bit. Don't know how many people visit this place. Don't know how many Germans or Austrians came here. It's an interesting place with some interesting personalities. And remember, this whole area was a settlement to some degree of Germans from before the war. There were several hundreds of thousands of Germans that lived in this area from before the Second World War. And of course, the whole area around Himmler's bunker was much larger than just his bunker. It was the area that was his. This whole area, of course, was under SS, and there's wooden barracks and buildings, offices, casinos. It was considered a fairly safe area for them at the time. So Himmler even had a tennis court built here, which seems only fair. You do have to stay in shape. And one thing I thought was interesting was crossing the road here in front of Himmler's bunker is what looks like an old Prussian road that stretches across what is now the main road today. And there were a lot of German settlers here. The Prussians weren't here building roads per se, but there were Germans in the neighborhood, and I'm thinking they built some of the old roads here when they moved here. But this whole area was an old German settlement, and today now, just like there was built during the war, in here's a military base. I'm starting to find out what has happened to all the 40,000 T-34s that was constructed during the war. There's practically one sitting at a monument in every small village and town all over all of the former Soviet territories. And here's yet another. Now today there's still a military base, large base operating in here, of course because of the ongoing war, lots of military. But what's interesting is there's a second Himmler bunker that still exists. However, it is on the military territory, and I do not feel like knocking on the door and asking if I could go film it with a camera at this very minute. But there's more to it. There's quite a few things hiding around. But now we're going to drive for about an hour and 15-some minutes down to Hitler's headquarters, which is just one shot down here in this general direction.
However, this was not the furthest headquarters east that would have been intended for Hitler. Führerhauptquartier Wassenburg, 300 kilometers southwest of Leningrad, was put into construction as Hitler wanted to follow the front. However, it was never visited by him, but later used as a headquarters for Army Group North. Today it is in Russia, and today used as a monastery with no traces left of the war.
One thing that's hard not to notice about Ukraine, living in Los Angeles, pothole city, where the glorious moron governor have not fixed the roads since the Civil War. Here, the roads are really good, nice, smooth. Oh, there's a lake. There's lots of lakes, lots of mosquitoes around here. Interesting thing is, one of the lakes here, Hitler's, well, actually further down, let's see if I can find it for you. Hitler's pilot, Bauer, he would have a swim wagon at his disposal, and whenever he had enough time over, he would take his swim wagon and roll it into the lake and fish. He always carried fishing rods and stuff with him. So when the locals would look at him in quiet amazement that he was driving his vehicle into the lake, he would sail around and fish quietly in the middle of the war. But this was quite a bit of the backwater to the war for a few years at least. A year at least. And remember that time frame, because when we get to Hitler's headquarters here, there's something to that number that will raise some questions about what might be under it or not. After a very long drive over very flat terrain, two things comes to mind as I'm turning into the town where Hitler's headquarters is how far Himmler placed himself from Hitler, although they had direct communication. It still is an hour and a half drive today, so then it would have been a bit more. Now, this is very built up, modernized during the 70s and 80s, or 60s and 70s, as the architecture portrays. But we're used to seeing Hitler's headquarters and things being out in the middle of woods, in the middle of nowhere. This is a little more surrounded by construction, which bothers me a bit, because that also means that there's going to be a lot of infrastructure that have been destroyed just from all the houses and buildings that have been built up. So we will see what we will see. Of course, the Germans did blow it up, and blow it up well. There's rubble sitting over there. It's kind of hard to tell what that is. or was.
For Hitler's eastern headquarters, 2 different locations had been suggested, one near Smolensk and the other near Lubny. They were considered for the Führerhauptquartier, but the availability now of a city of moderate significance, but with a sophisticated transport junction nearby, seemed a better choice. So the city of Venezia, with 93,000 inhabitants, was chosen. The complex was to consist of 83 wooden houses, 3 main bunkers encased in several lines of barbed wire fencing, a lot of smaller infantry fighting in defensive positions. The Sperrkreis 1 was Hitler's area, and the military command alone. This included 19 working structures and 2 concrete bunkers. The rest were outside in Sperrkreis 2 and 3. Hitler's house and bunker was always number 11 at all of his headquarter complexes. To camouflage the complex, initially sited in a field near the forest, they planted 800 trees, several thousand bushes, 12,000 square meters of grass, and a lot of fake trees. On the other side, the wood line to the north was completely cleared into an open field. In addition to the forestry, about 1 kilometer away was the granite quarry, from where the stone for the complex came. The construction of the Wehrwolf can be divided into 2 stages. The main phase was initiated from December 15, 1941 to July 16, 1942, the day Hitler arrived the first time. This initial phase of the construction had utilized 1,200 Soviet prisoners of war, who would later be commissioned for the construction of the 5th Durchgangsstraße, the main road leading to the front to ease logistics. It was later falsely claimed that all the workers of the complex were Russian prisoners of war. This was not true. Until April 1942, over 8,000 Organisation Tod workers worked here. The OKH staff, altogether 9,200 people, would be allocated within the city in apartments. The local universities and the asylum was chosen to place the officers, and the regular soldiers was housed in a former Russian army base nearby, and of course a huge airfield would be constructed as well. The second construction phase was in January 1943 until July, where Hitler was absent, in order to create new zones for the operating personnel, as well as to winterize the existing buildings. It saw 1,250 Organisation Tod workers here, and the Russian prisoners of war were no longer utilized, mostly due to the need for secrecy. The total figure of the man-days of work here from 1941 to 43 was 332,000.
It is at least a nice autumn day to see a bunch of decommissioned statues of Lenin and the great heroes of the Soviet Union. I'm sure there's not going to be a whole lot of German graves around here. So, outer perimeter security, I don't think there's any chance to find any part of that, unfortunately, since everything seems to be built up around here. Some wrecks of an old BMP, I think. Seems appropriate. There's not nearly as much left here as there are of the complex in Poland. Also, this was not as big. And blown up extremely well, as you can tell. Damn. So, I think this is the remnants of one of the officers' bunkers. I suppose it's appropriate to have at least a couple of tank wrecks sitting here. It's interesting that from 25 June, the headquarters of the Southern Front was already located here. So, when the Russians moved out unceremoniously in July 21, the Germans initially occupied the region that had been set up as a Russian headquarters, which makes perfect sense. Wow. Now these bunkers, they were smaller than what we see in Poland at Wolfschanze, but damn, this looks like the roof. This is the roof. This is the roof that blew up and came down on its back right there. The steel beams are looking traces, but they're not there anymore. It's 4.5 meters thick roof. The walls 2.5 meter, of course reinforced. Still amazing that it blew up like this, but just look at the bits and pieces lying around. This was 7 by 17 meters. Yeah, at least you can still see the outline of it.
The general purpose bunker was 15 meters in length, 11.5 meters in width, with walls of 2.5 meters in thickness, leaving it cool enough to store wine in.
I'm actually thinking from here, that's where they came from. I think these are some of the walls from the general bunker. This literally came here from several hundred meters in that direction. They were not kidding around here when they blew these up. This was job well done. And the area is quite well fenced in from Cold War, post-war activity and growth of the city, which does not bode well for the close defensive area. Oh well.
Here was a large wooden building, the officers' mess or casino, where Hitler would dine with his officers every day. There is nothing left of the building today, as it was all wooden, but there was some measure of comfort here. There was also a sauna, a pool, and a bar.
Rebar in it. See how big the complex actually is as we go through it. And once again, this did not start here, it just landed here. I wonder if it's part of the roof. I can't really tell, to be honest. Wow. They used a lot of explosives here. No, I think this is the wall. There was, if this was something, it wasn't sitting. No. This is from over there. These are from over there. Wow. What are they right there? So of course, there's a lot of stories and an enormous amount of gossip and more rumors. But let's start from the beginning. The workers who worked here and constructed this, the majority of them were German, French workers for the construction and electricians. There was some forced laborers here. All they did was build the roads here. Goering had a special train that had 4 kilometers of special track laid for him. None of the workers were killed after having constructed this. That's one of the stories. And a lot of the locals eventually made their way to work in Germany. And a lot of the girls ended up marrying quite a few of the workers because they were sought by the NKVD after the war. We have to remember again, this was Ukraine, and they were generally sympathetic to the Germans. Of course not if they were Jewish, but, well, the Jews in the area here where Hitler had his headquarters were of course evacuated, short of some 800 that could work, and they were put to work.
There is no reason found to believe that those working here were executed after the work. All kinds of workers from different nations and organizations were brought here to install electricity, set up the walls, assemble buildings, make roads, etc. And when they were done, they would be sent somewhere else, close to other projects.
From the entrance in the general bunker, some 300-400 meters, the exclusion zone begins. Of course, all the paths were camouflaged by netting, as were the bunkers, by a firm that still exists today, by the way. There was radio communication, of course, kitchens, amenities, lots of guard towers, little guard shacks around, machine gun positions, lots of communication between both here and to Berlin and to Himmler's bunker ran here. And there were, of course, no trees at the time, as there are today. They planted 800 trees and thousands of bushes, some of them fake, all around here, this area. And there was some 6 kilometers of wire fabric, camouflage netting, barbed wire fences, mines, and all that. So this was the headquarters shelter, where the operations were being conducted. So you would have meeting room and radio room, communications. And this is the wall that I've broken off. I have no idea what the ceiling is yet, but get an idea of generally how big this was. Wow, this is really well blown up. Looks like that could be the ceiling there. This was constructed with gravel from the local gravel pit a couple of kilometers away, granite. And there's another gossip story about that the granite was part of what endangered Hitler's health. So let's do the other gossip story. Hitler did not have a particularly good health at the end of the war, as we know. It looked like Parkinson's, and to me, knowing a bit about nutrition, it looked like he was severely malnourished based on his vegetarian diet and what they gave him to eat. His dietitian kept it on very little, and I looked at his diet. There was very little in there of sustenance, of vitamins. No wonder he wasn't doing well. Plus, of course, his doctor gives him all sorts of strange drugs, Pervitin and what have you, uppers and downers, and he was not in good health at the end. And this started deteriorating as he was here for several years, which was a miserable place to be in the summer. 40 plus degrees, mosquitoes, cold, freezing in the winter, hot, humid, wet in the summer. And apparently his health, as it was seen since he was here for years, his health deteriorated here. It was noticed here by his staff. This might be part of the roof. It could also be said his health may have deteriorated if he had stayed back in Berlin. Because, I mean, here you did have creature comforts, you had the bathhouses, and it was rudimentary. He was not a luxury living kind of guy, but the German soldiers, they had their sauna and bathhouses, and Himmler had his tennis court, things like that. Hitler was not really one to waste time when he finally got up to do things other than walk Blondie. But one of the stories about his health was that the quarry and the granite here that was used for the bunkers, including his, was radioactive, and he was poisoned by that from staying in the bunker. Except he didn't stay in his bunker. He stayed in the house attached to it, and quite possibly never set foot in it other than for show.
And one may wonder how the weather would affect a man's psyche and the decisions he made here during the war. Hitler's fatigue began back in the hot July days of 1942, after having been troubled with constant headaches. These were times where crucial, critical wartime decisions had been made, like the one he made on July 23, 1942. That was the second day of Hitler's brain fever, according to his doctor Theodor Morell. On that day at Wehrwolf, Adolf Hitler ordered the German forces to advance further to the east, onto the Caucasus, or the Volga River, Stalingrad, a decision which would finally derail Plan Blau, and lead to the tragedy of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Traudl Junge, Hitler's secretary, would write about how terrible the heat was and how it affected even her health at a young age. Morell, Hitler's physician, later testified that Hitler did suffer brain fever between the 22nd and 29th of July. Testifying to Morell's recalling several memories of the former Wehrmacht staff and attendees, later written independently and at varying times, refer to the unbearable heat and dampness inside the wooden buildings of the military headquarters near Venezia. One of the outdoorsy thermostats was put on a tree a few steps next to the entrance of Hitler's house, that he would still read it as he went for a walk with Blondie every day. Hitler would spend a total of 118 days here during the war, over 3 separate occasions, as opposed to the 800 days he spent at his Polish headquarters. But still, something must be said about the constant references to his health and failing health during this time of the stays here in Ukraine.
And here you see the underground water mains. Of course, there's waterworks. There's pipes running all under the complex here throughout. Now this could be the roof line over here of the command center, as I was saying. The granite here, some stones do emanate some radiation of various degrees, but not really enough that it should have affected Hitler here. I say another gossip story. He had enough reasons why he was in bad health without us having to invent a story about radiation. Another gigantic lump from nowhere. Must be from in there. Except we haven't seen what's blown up in here. Now I know they put a bunch of trees up here. I don't know if these trees are the remnants of those trees, or these have just sprouted on their own. Ukraine is very flat out here. So, and another interesting tidbit, when the German settlers came here in the late 1800s, this was a very, shall we say, wild, untamed nature. Lots of plants and swamps, mosquitoes and wolves, which is kind of interesting that his nickname was Wehrwolf, or Wolf, and this was Werwolf, and there was actually wild wolves roaming around. I hope Blondie didn't fraternize.
Hitler's residence was all constructed in wood, large wooden building. It was accompanied and connected to a small concrete bunker of nearly square shape, 10.6 by 10 meters in width. The only entrance to the shelter was from within Hitler's house, for himself and his cabinet in case of an air raid. It was slightly larger than Himmler's bunker, it appears. Hitler's residence was all large wooden structures containing his private offices, main office, bedrooms, and so forth, where he would often hold meetings with the various dignitaries that would be visiting, and these officers that were needed here for the day's conference. There was air condition, but multiple people of the complex complained about the functionality.
So this is the remains of Hitler's bunker. Or the roof of it, and it stood here. Wow. What is this also? Let's see how deep it is. See where the ground floor was. And see the outline of it. Wow. Now, what is interesting about this take a look at. I almost feel like this should be the roof that pancaked. With the beams. Either that or it will be the floor, which means the walls just broke off symmetrically. They used an ungodly amount of explosives to destroy this much. Of course, Hitler was not here continuously. He was in between here and Poland and a few other places, but for the most part, this is where he was. And this is where he ordered that the German army should take and hold Stalingrad. Don't know if, again, we're back to this was a place of bad decisions. Communication or power. There was a power station constructed a couple of kilometers from here as well, of course, that would have had a bunker as well. Now, this hole is interesting because it is just a hole. And some years after the war, there was a German doctor whose name completely eludes me at this point. He wrote a book about the many levels of underground tunnels that were here and under the bunker system here. That there was multiple levels of tunnels. He wrote, I think, 7. Now the doctor was here, and under the possibility of some number of drinks, his memory may have warped him ever so slightly. It's not like anybody after the war would embellish on the truth and to make money, personal gain, or keep their head on their shoulders. Did I mention the doctor, by the way, became a millionaire in this book? There was even also a movie made about it. The thing about that is it is completely untrue. There's nothing in the underground here to be seen. It simply was not possible for there to be that much underground. First of all, it's a pretty swampy area, for one. And this was constructed in some year and a half. Remember, the biggest Führer bunker in Berlin wasn't done until 43, 44, still being worked on. So there was just not time to build such an elaborate underground here. They were only here for a few years. However, there was a quarry nearby, and possibly the good doctor staggered into the mining tunnels and got confused.
It is simply impossible for here to be multiple levels of underground. There would not be time to construct this in the little time they had to build, and only a couple of meters below the grass begins the granite layer.
And again, there are pipes running throughout the complex.
And the good Andrew told me to take a look and see if I could find any of the German hydrants that are still sitting around town, here and around Himmler's headquarters. Well, some things you do need a coordinate for. That will be one of them. Or 3 of them, actually. There was 3. Hitler would have a constant stream of visitors and dignitaries here, such as Ian Antonescu, the ruler of Romania, and the Croatian leader, Ante Pavlech. All army group commanders would visit him here, and the OKH was installed in the Venezia University building. The flights of the attendees would be serviced by a separate air unit, known as the Fliegerstaffel des Führers, quartered in a separate airfield 25 kilometers from Venezia, and supervised by Hans Bauer, personal pilot. He would later recall the high capacity of the airfield, as well as the exceptional taste of the Ukrainian noodles and eggs. It was also claimed that Russian General Vaslov met Hitler here. However, they never did. He was, however, at the German army headquarters for a time, during which he was charmed over to the German side to fight against Stalin. He was an extremely competent commander and had been instrumental in saving Moscow in 1941. But he would change sides in 1942. And as Himmler would also speak to Hitler about inviting Ukraine in as an equal access partner, especially towards the latter years. Hitler, however, always held some distrust towards the Slavic people in general, but as we would see, Vaslov and his army would fight until the end, where the British would hand him back over to Stalin to be executed, and Himmler would raise several foreign SS divisions as well.
Here's the water reservoir. Obviously not a pool, unlike other pools that actually are pools, because you can see where the springboards were. This was the fire pond. And one thing that I find intriguing is that it is not, or it certainly doesn't seem to be, covered in water-resistant tar. But I guess it didn't have to be, because it's still holding water after all this time.
It is claimed that this fire pond was not well suited for swimming. It was covered by high suspended camouflage netting so the sun would not reflect light upwards, leaving the water cold even in the summer. However, one of the surviving photos clearly shows a springboard, so I wager to say that swimming did happen here, especially during the hot summers, but it was a fire pond nonetheless.
And in here, of course, Bormann had a house right up from Hitler's bunker and house right there. No remains of that. All the wooden buildings were also burnt before the Soviets got here, of course. This is not even the least remains of one of Hitler's bunkers. The one in the Black Forest. There's less left of that.
It was also claimed that Eva Braun visited Hitler here, which she never did. She also never visited him in Poland. The poor girl, all alone during a war with nowhere to go.
This would officially be the most suspect thing I found here. A huge slab of cemented over Y in the middle of the complex. Something. Alright, this will be a question to ask. Why? Alright, inquiries have been made. The cemented over place was where they had military vehicles on exhibition. But I guess a collection of military vehicles in one place at this time may call undue attention. And it wouldn't be the first time in history that bombed out wrecks of tanks have been bombed multiple times just because the pilots weren't sure if they were done, so make sure to cook them again or some more.
Relations with the locals were generally not bad, and trade would take place between German soldiers and locals. Hitler's personal bodyguard, Milch, would later write in his memoirs that he had practiced kind of a barter with the locals, exchanging knitting needles sent by his wife in exchange for sunflower oil or geese. However, as the war worsened and foodstuffs were confiscated from Ukrainians in order to feed German soldiers as the needs arose and increased.
There was a press office in here. I doubt Goebbels ever visited, although, it's possible. Lots of footage of people flying in and out of here. Certainly Himmler and Hitler. Goering had his train for the most part. And in here are the remains of the press bunker somewhere, and an officer's hotel, casino somewhere.
And just to shed a little clarity on where everything's are within Speerhuis 1 alone, 1 is the pool, 2 is the cinema, 3 was Bormann's house, 4 was the typist's building, 5 was Hitler's house with the bunker, 6 was the casino, 7 was the tea house, 8 was the adjutant's house, 9 the general's house, 10 one of the hotels, 11 the press office, 12 another hotel, 13 communication and post building, 14 was the sauna, 15 was the officer's bunker of the OKW, and 16 was the adjutant's. 17 was the Wehrmacht's headquarters, 18 was the command post, 19 was the security services, and 20 was the mess.
I would not recommend going through this area with metal detector or anything, because pretty much everything was removed or destroyed and accounted for as such. The only thing that was not accounted for in this area as having been lost and not found was one SS officer's ring. Several documents attest to how he lost his ring while he was drinking. But another little myth we can just deal with: the Germans were not really heavy drinkers. Certainly not in a place like this. Certainly not if Himmler or Hitler was around. Neither one of them would drink schnapps or beer here and there, but that's about it. And you'll see pictures of Christmas parties with German soldiers and officers. They would drink beers or wines, but not to excess. Not like the Russian soldiers that would drink heavy liquors. And I hate to say it, but the way the Russian soldiers behaved is not much different than the way they behave today, where I thought they were more educated. But you know what? The officer schools in Russia teach their officers to not specifically not abide by the rules of war, citing that soldiers or armies that obey by the rules of war, they'll lose, which is many times true. And you got to break some rules to win, I suppose. I just don't understand why it always needs to be about raping or killing women and children. Then and now. Call me old-fashioned. I would think there are some rules of war or humanity we should be able to stick to, although we can't even seem to stick to those in European countries. We never learn, do we? Read my book.
On March 13th, 1943, Hitler left his Ukrainian headquarters, and on his flight back to Rastenburg, he made a short stop at the headquarters of the Armored Group Center near Smolensk. That very day, it is well known for the fact, as Colonel von Treskov succeeded in delivering a bomb to the plane, which failed to detonate. Hitler, however, would never again visit after leaving on August 27, 1943, and on December 28, 1943, Manstein secured Hitler's personal approval for leaving the Wehrwolf complex in Ukraine, to move the headquarters to the west by 110 kilometers. The logistical operation would be complete as soon as January 6th, and the headquarters near Venezia had then been completely destroyed on orders from Hitler, as he was very clear that his personal belongings not later be exhibited in some Moscow museum. As soon as the last officer of Army Group South left the headquarters, the furniture and household objects, provisions, were all evacuated to the west in a large column of trucks. The major part of the wooden constructions were then dismantled by the special unit, would then bring in aerial bombs to the site. These charges were put in the concrete bunkers, and the explosions devastated both the buildings, with their walls of 3-meter thickness, as well as the landscape. The special unit also wrecked the communications, sewage, and water pipes. On March 20th, 1944, the Red Army regained the town, and the NKVD began to round up sympathizers with the Germans and looking for documents on the site, but none were found. The site would sit abandoned until 2011, and during this time all remaining wood, bricks, pipe were stripped by locals, leaving very little left to preserve.
Here lays the grave of the fallen Soviet Union. The remains of all those gigantic statues and symbols that they always put up to commemorate sometimes heroically fighting soldiers and sometimes pilots who bailed out and left their crew to die and yet became heroes of the Soviet Union post-mortem, only to figure out his body wasn't where it's supposed to be. That's a different story. It is a fun story though. Let's just remember the Soviet Union is dead and gone. In this area alone, there's over 1,500 monuments to fallen Russian soldiers from the Second World War. That was a little sad somehow. There's so little left that it's... If it wasn't for a few signs, nobody would have any idea what was there. Not much information in the museum either. But it would be nice with some models, maybe. Something. However, I don't always get what I want. And apparently neither did Hitler, which is why he had to blow up his headquarters. So, on to a different war. Or hopefully the end of all of them, but that would be, I suppose, naive and optimistic.
Hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel, liking, follows, and maybe even join me on Patreon to help out. I am just a guy, a historian, traveling around all these historic places in Europe on my own dime, trying to bring them to you.